cord. Got it. Whatever's in the middle. There's a button in the
The big
middle.
one is in the middle.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks for letting us come in.
Yeah, of course.
It was really helpful. So much better than last year with the error being additive.
Yeah, I feel like it's clicking in my class. It's like clicking. You know how it just like takes a minute for me to be like, right. And so it seems like most of the kids in here are getting it, but talking to Ms. Garcia and Ms. McCormick, Mr. Smith's kind of like not quite there yet.
Well, and I think the problem is it's a really conceptual.
Yes.
Like
You have to see it.
You have to understand area, and then you have to see. Okay, I get that works, and then I have to put it together. And spatial reasoning is one of the off areas that sometimes you have like a scholar who might be really good at it that's not good in other math areas. Just one thing to note, and I put it in the general noticing section, I swapped out 100%. I was finding I had nothing of value to add, and I don't want to get nitpicky where it starts to turn into like one child's shoe was untied. So I want you, Ms. Garcia, to touch base about what you would like to do. If you would like to keep it, your prerogative, but my recommendation would be to switch over to 3 instructional goals.
Yeah, that's what we had talked about at our debrief. Remember,
we kind of touched base.
And then when I saw, I hadn't seen Ms. Garcia for a debrief until after this lesson.
Got it.
And so we talked about it at our debrief.
And what are you guys thinking?
And we're going to swap it out. She had said that I can kind of think about ratio or something else, but this is
you can do differentiation. You can do anything that you feel like, oh, I really want to work on this. The other thing I would encourage you to do is really drill down on like what subject areas do I want the most help in. So I came to math because Ms. Williams and I wanted to see a math lesson, and I had told her that your checking for understanding is really strong and the lesson moves pretty quickly. So that's why we came into math. I do find that all of your lessons are really solid, but your math lessons are excellent. So if you want to keep going in math, good job, you. If you want to keep going in math, we can keep going in math and kind of stretch out like how far we're going to be able to take this. Like, let's make this baby really work. Your data's coming back phenomenal. Or you can say like, I don't want to work on math, I just want to work on writing. I just want to work on writing conferences. I just want to work on TA, whatever it is. So take some time to think about it and let me know. And then I can fit that into my schedule so that you're not getting things that aren't useful. Before you read the feedback, you had a chance to read it. Before we jump in, I wanted to ask about the strength underneath CFU for number 2. So it was really interesting to watch the math class, and it's something that I've noticed in your math class, and it's something I've noticed in Ms. Scott's math class. So it stood out to me that there was kind of that open, flowing conversation, but it was very productive. So both Janai and I can't remember Noel, they both asked questions, and both of the questions that they asked were actually relevant, and not just like, why is that? I don't get it, because they targeted things like the distributive property, or well, why aren't we tiling if we've been tiling in the past for area, particularly for Sweet Janai is the bottom of the barrel in this group. So she would trend towards the more concrete, but I wanted to ask kind of how you set that up. So how does that work? Because it works really well. And
no, it does. And this is not unusual for my math class. Like they ask a lot of questions, and I think I was watching Miss Montgomery's. We watched our lessons kind of side by side for this lesson, just so that we could see like, are we teaching the same thing? Like what's going on with the data because it's confusing. And there's a lot. Like the way it seems in the 2 classes is these kids are constantly taking in information, and they're like, wait a second, let me think about that. I don't get this specific part of it, and like they're really actively taking the information. But thinking about like how it got like that, probably at the so Brendan can really like. There's a couple of kids in my class who can really articulate what they're thinking, and they're the kids who I think I leveraged early on in the year.
So starting off, I'm just
to like ask really strong questions. Okay. But then. And at the beginning of the year, I also did a lot of like, if I had done this, like what mistake must I have made? Or like, why didn't I do it this way? I asked a lot of those questions, and so I think they're probably starting to ask those questions more on their own. Okay. Because I remember at the beginning of the year, I asked a ton of those questions, like a lot of feigning ignorance, or a lot of like, why did I do that? Why wouldn't I do something another way? Okay. Janai does stand out as somebody who has asked lots of questions since the very beginning. She knows when she's
her question was good, and her question was a good one. Like I think the thing that stood out to me was one, it made it very much like a workshop-y, like we're doing this together. But the other thing that I thought was really phenomenal about it is that there were 2 misunderstandings embedded in there that you you wouldn't have gotten to, not because you did a great job checking for understanding, but you wouldn't have gotten there because that wasn't, they had nothing to do with what you were talking about for the day. So if they had not said tiling and distributive property, that kind of would have lurked under the surface for both of them. And neither, I mean, I know Janai's on the lower end, Noel's kind of in the middle of the math group. So he's not extremely high, so it's not like he's the only weird one in the corner, like, what about the distributive property? How does that work? He's pretty much a target kid in the class. Did you experience any issues in terms of like off-task questions? And if you did, how did you handle off-task questions? The answer could be no.
A lot of times I'm just like, well, that doesn't really apply to what we're doing today, so I'll touch base. I think there's sometimes they've gotten me like kind of on a tangent, like this has nothing to do with what I'm talking about today. I'm not going to give you an answer for this now. If you're really interested in that question, I will talk to you later.
We can
like
Emmanuel
asked some of those questions, and I'm just like, no.
So kind of know who's who, and then
and just be like,
ignore what's off.
No, we're not that. Or like that we'll get to there in high school. No, not relevant right now.
Okay. And I just thought that was neat, and I don't know, I mean, it's something, again, like I said, I've seen it in Miss Scott's room also, and the things that you guys have in common is first, you're both the math planners for your grade, and second, you're both teaching the high math classes, and so I'm wondering if that is part of the equation. Not necessarily the other, I feel like you both just, part of the reason I think your math lessons go so well is you just truly understand what you're explaining to them, so you're understanding when they're saying things like, no, that's not relevant, or yes, that's relevant, and I'm going to take a second to dispel that misunderstanding. So there's that part, but then it's also, like you said, they're processing what you're saying. So even if they're processing it and they're quick enough to know, like, that does not make sense. What you just said to me does not work for what I've got in my head. So it could be a combination of those two things, but it's definitely something that I want to start pushing into other higher math classes because I do think it's absolutely critical because
it's super helpful because they understand so much more conceptually, I think, than the other classes because they're like, I did this before, and like,
they're making the connections to their background knowledge, and then you're either able to say like, yes, that is relevant, that's the right schema to be pulling from, or like, no, I know why you think that, but that is not connected to this. So they're able to give you things to work with, so that you're able to help them sort relevant versus irrelevant background knowledge. So if I can ask you to do me a favor, I connected with Mr. Rahman. He's the 4th grade math teacher for the high group. I'm almost positive that he teaches the high group. So if you can kind of start a dialogue with him about that concept and maybe even pull Ms. Sky into the conversation and Mr. Amaya as the 2nd grade one, because I do think that as we move more and more into math talk, which is what we'll talk about during the debrief today, as we move more and more into math talk and trying to get them to explain things conceptually, I think it's really critical that we're opening up the floor, at least right now, to the high math groups to get there. Because otherwise I just don't think we're ever going to be able to get them to really critically challenge or unpack what we're trying to teach them. So if you could kind of take that on, just kind of talk to those teachers, either email them, set up a meeting, whatever it is, and just loop me in. So if I'm able to go, because I do think it's something that was unique and stood out as an area of strength. In terms of the other things that I want to talk through is the big buckets are questioning, not just the whole questioning, but how to use questioning to kind of increase conceptual understanding and to really probe further, especially since they have that capacity to kind of tangle with it. They can. And then the other thing is in instances where you are doing it and you're doing a lot of it, where they're doing a lot of really specific work, which is great. Your CFUs aren't like, what's the process that I use? You use that once, which was important. It was in between the teacher model and the guided practice, but not every time it's like, what did I just do? What did I just do? There was a lot of like, why did I do this specific thing? Why did I use this specific thing? So very specific questioning, but thinking about how you can structure their talk so that you're improving the way they're speaking. So which of the two do you want to talk through first?
We can start with that.
With that. So these are really going to be taking your areas of strength and figuring out what are the structures that you can use if you have them in the right spot. So there are a few examples of where you did this is you had them turn to their partners and talk about everything that they knew about rectangles. So it was a great way of, I think that's another part of going back to what we were talking before, another part of why they're thinking is because you're saying, well, what do we know about rectangles? Let's just start there. Forget this weird composite shape. Let's just start with what do you know about rectangles? And it was a great question. What do you know? Tell everything you know to your partner. And that was a turn talk. And they talked, and I think that they probably came up with the definition.
Yeah,
I'm sure they came up with what
yeah.
they needed to come up with, and they at least definitely came up with a point, which is that opposite sides are equal, because that's what you were looking for. But thinking through that specific example when you're having them describe stuff, using a voiceover strategy or using pre-turn and talk, like specific criteria. So that would look either like they're talking to their partners and you're saying something over them, like, one thing I know about rectangles is, another thing I know is, a final thing I know is, this is similar to squares because, but it's different because this is going to help me in composite problems, and really getting them to talk through it. And it's that concept we talked about in writing too, of like talking long about something and not just talking about a rectangle has 4 sides, the opposite sides are equal, all the angles are equal.
Right.
Kind of like when you have them turn and talk and said, like, turn and tell your partner they like this side, and they all like 5. And then you follow really, really fast with, how do you know? But it was just so funny.
They do that a lot.
But it's great. I mean, God bless them. They're so correct. It was like 5. So that's an example where I think that voiceover, or you can do the pre-turn talk the pre-turn talk specific criteria of partner A, you're going to tell everything you know about rectangles. Right. Partner B, you're going to connect it to squares, and you're going to connect it to our work with composite shapes.
Okay, I've been doing that more in ELA stuff, so that'd be good for them.
Yep, just pulling it down to
like,
math.
you're going to say this, and you're going to say this.
Yep, because otherwise they don't think about it. They're never going to get that second part of talk about how connects to squares, they're not going to get there. Right. They just aren't, because they haven't been exposed to it enough to know that that's a path they can go. They're compliant, and the behavior in here is really strong, so they're like, you told me to talk about rectangles, I'm going to share all I'm not going to talk about a square, I'm going to tell you what I know about a rectangle. And they stay out of territory that they kind of feel like they're not supposed to be in. In terms of another opportunity for it is that process questioning. So you did ask that turn and talk. This is questioning number 2. You had that turn and talk around the process where you turn and tell your partner the steps that I took to complete the problems, and that was in the teacher model. And this is another example that I think will actually be most helpful for your lower kids in this group of like, how many steps do you actually have, and like actually having them either, you're going to name the 5 steps out on your finger. That's an example of pre-turn and talk criteria. Name the 5 steps out on your fingers, and then the other partner, you can add anyone that they miss, or at the end you're going to explain why they're important, or you're going to explain step number 2, whatever you want it to be, or voicing over the first thing I did, the second thing I did, and really using the sequence words to drill down that there's a specific number of steps. Because I can see someone like Janai needing to like latch onto, well, how many are there? Like, what exactly am I supposed to do in exactly what order? Not like get the gist of it. Like, first I have to find all the side lengths, then I need to do this. Like, no, what do I do? Point number 1. And she's so cute.
I know. Actually though, it's funny because my math class has now changed because Cameron and Sylvester didn't come back. Those are like 2 of my lowest kids in here, so now it's like just Janai as like a standout. And then like Brian sometimes will just be like.
But he's a little bit it's more of if he's plugging in, is he not plugging in?
Yeah.
With Janai,
her steps are going to be really crucial.
And the thing with her, and I think that the reason that she's in this group, and I saw it in first and second grade with her, is she will do whatever you tell her to a T. And on her test, I remember last year Mr. Maya graded one of her tests, and it was like, just like every problem had a strategy. She had a checklist, she had this, she does what you ask. So the more we can give her, I think that's how she makes it.
She can be successful.
And that's how she makes it in here.
But if she asks a question when she's confused, you tell her, she's like, great, thank you very much.
She's a good little learner. She actually is a good student, as opposed to just like really good at math. Like Brendan is just a truly strong math student, I don't think.
He just understands it.
He does.
And then he's like, but why did you do that way so it would be faster? I'm like,
and
because other people need to learn that.
And Christian Tovar is like that. I'm sure you remember that.
Yeah, exactly.
In 5th grade, where it's like, or you could have just divided the whole thing by 4. I know. I just didn't want to do it that way.
Some people don't understand how you made that jump, and you're going to tell me how I did it. So.
Which of the 2 do you think would be most helpful in math? So given math planning, which do you think is more helpful? The pre-turn and talk criteria of like the partner A, partner B roles, or doing the voiceover? Or is it just teacher preference?
I think the easiest one for me to start with is probably going to be the criteria. Okay. And then like once I am better at prepping like what I actually want them to say during their turn and talk.
That's the hardest part.
And then the voiceover will come once that becomes more of a like, well, we're going to talk for a long time about something, and you have a lot of things you need to say.
Right.
And so I think this one's easier to start with and then building up to voiceovers.
Okay, and then can you connect with Ms. Garcia about that? I wouldn't
Yeah.
push that into Mr. Smith or Ms. Montgomery's rooms yet, because I think that they need to focus a little bit more on what they're saying and less on what the kids are saying. But in Ms. Garcia's room, she is really, really clear when she's instructing them, and they're, doing as well as we could kind of expect given the relative weakness that they have. So I think that she'd be in a space where that would be really helpful for her, because they also, less out of being succinct and direct like your group is, they are definitely brief in their answers. No, I don't think it's coming from the same place of just like, I know the answer, so I'm just say the answer. It's coming from a different place. It's still happening. Any question about that before we jump into the questioning?
No, this is good.
Okay, so in terms of questioning, this is going to jump around all over the place, and this is something that you can think about in terms of math plans, but it's more execution-wise, because it's going to be more in response to like things that the scholars are bringing up or points that you're emphasizing based on the data that you gathered. So this was additive day 2, so there were things obviously from day 1 that were popping up as like. So you can't have 3 dimensions in a rectangle, and that clearly sounded like an error that they were making probably the day before, or at least an error that you knew that they were.
They're picking multiple numbers, like you need.
That doesn't fit. What are you going to do with the third number? Were they just multiplying all 3 together?
They were like looking at shapes that had like an L on the outside, and like this one was equal 2 and this one was equal 3, and they're like, no, you can't.
So they have their own,
put stuff
together. And then imagine on day 1 that introducing the concept of additive. So like they're good on area, they know it's length times width, length times width. But then all of a sudden, it's now addition has been introduced into the equation. And there was some evidence of that misunderstanding in the gesture.
Was doing it, and Noel, I think, did it a little bit. I'm just thinking,
and I don't know if the CFU point you read through that with the multiplication. So some of them were stuck there. And I think probably given the strength of what they were saying and everything else, that was more just.
Yeah, maybe, I don't think they heard my question.
I think that they were more like, what do you do with area? I think that that's probably what it was. But just thinking about how to respond to that so that you can make sure that it's not some kind of mass coup of misunderstanding that someone has spread. In terms of the questioning, it's really breaking into 3 buckets. Hypothetical questioning, strategy questioning, and then evaluation or evaluating questioning. In terms of hypothetical questioning, this is something that across all subjects we really want to push, but I think in math is like particularly interesting because in math, and because you've got the kids who are giving you their misunderstandings and they're asking you like, well, why can't we do blank? Why can't we do blank? And really thinking about, well, what are the common errors that I'm going to see and what are the things that I'm going to be consistently repeating, and then playing it out through hypothetical questioning. So in the example of that point that you were making really clearly of you can't have 3 dimensions. It just can't have 3. It doesn't make sense. This won't work. Really asking them like, well, what would happen if I chose 4 instead of 3? What would that do to the area of the shape? What would I actually be describing? If I did this number times this number, what am I really finding the area of? Or let's say that we were to add these numbers instead of multiply them. What happens then? And really playing out the scenario, because then what you're doing is you're not just identifying the procedural flaw of like you need 2, you need 2, you need 2. You're identifying, let's talk about what happens if you don't have that. What are you actually doing if you're making that type of mistake? Another place that procedural or hypothetical questions, are really helpful are alternative methods for the same answer. And this connects to that concept of what you were trying to do with, or not trying to do, but you were very clear with, of I can cut it this way and I can cut it this way. And really asking them, well, what would have happened? What would have happened to the area of this composite figure if I had cut vertically instead of horizontally? Turn and tell your partner what would have happened and how you know that would be the case. And then the idea would be that they would say nothing would happen because it would be the same it would be the same area, not volume. It would be the same area, no matter which way we did it. And then the third way is to really show the conceptual idea. So it's not necessarily highlighting an error, but it's changing something and asking them what if. So saying like, okay, so this shape we decided that the length of the rectangle is going to be 4 and our width is going to be 2. What would happen to the area if I changed that 2 to a 3? Just what would happen to it? Would it be larger or smaller? What would get larger? Interesting. What if I made it like the 3 into a 5? It would get larger again. Well, why would that happen? Because every time you make a dimension larger, the area inside the space is going to be bigger. and getting them to see that type of concept. So those are the
Okay.
3 ways that hypothetical questioning can be really valuable in math in particular. Strategy questioning, it just really, Janai, again, really great point about tiling, and I'm sure that was her saving grace in the beginning of area. Like, I got this, I can count my rectangles, I want to, and she probably wants to draw unit squares for every single shape that she comes across, and she probably would, despite the size. But with her in particular, and others who are more similar to her, less similar to like a Brendan, really asking that strategy question on the applying level in one of 2 ways. Either, well, Janai, give me an example of where tiling, it would technically work,
Right.
but wouldn't be a smart idea. Can you give me an example of numbers that I would be working with where it just would not make sense for me to draw a unit square? Or if you don't think she's ready for that, because that's a little bit more heavy lifting, saying to her, okay, Janai, that's fine, that would work here. Let's say, for example, that I had 20 times 200. Is that an example where the strategy of tiling would be a good choice?
Right.
And see if she'd be able to say no, and then probing further with like, well, why would that not be a good choice? Why would that work?
Yeah.
It would work. It works.
Right.
You can do it. But why would you not want to do that?
Right.
Oh, because the number would be massive and it would take forever, and you're likely to make errors drawing 400 units. You probably wouldn't say that part, but you're likely to make a mistake with the 400 unit squares. So really, those 2 types of applying questions, and I think we have been emphasizing, and I know I have in my feedback been emphasizing the first of like, give an instance when, but I think that the other of take an instance and explain how it fits into something is equally valid. And it's actually so much more helpful for someone like a Janai, because it will be clear and she'll be able to say like, oh, that's way too big of a number. So it makes the point, pushes the work onto her, but does it in a way that's not so like, I don't know what number to tell you. And then she ends up being more confused. And that's that's absolutely not what you want. And then the last is related to evaluation criteria. So you were making a point to explain to them the concept, and this was really connected to the undergirding of the concept that that area is additive. It doesn't matter if I cut it this way, if I cut it that way, if I cut it into 6 million pieces, if I cut it into 2, it's always going to come out to be the same, because the space inside of that shape is not changing. And the way that you were deciding is you were deciding yourself a logical way to cut the shape. Like, sometimes really long skinny rectangles are hard for them to see, or sometimes you're looking and like a dimension is missing in one spot, and it's like, well, if I cut it this way, I know all the dimensions. But that part was made transparent. So really working with them through evaluation question on, well, what criteria do I use to make this choice? It's going to work any way I do it, but I have a higher likelihood of success one way compared to another.
So I kind of did that yesterday. So they were solving, or was yesterday the day after? I can't remember. Okay, yes, we did it yesterday, and I was like, okay, so we could split this either way. Well, let's try it both ways. And so I had them doing it both ways, and I'm like, now that we've done it both ways, we have the same answer. Which way would you prefer to have done it? And they're like, that way, because we have all the things, we don't have to do any extra work. I'm like, so if you look at a shape, you should be doing this, like, wouldn't you want to do that work before you already did this whole long thing and figure out, well, if I split it this way, like, it's going to be much easier. Would that be a way to go about, like, showing them that, like, it's
better than
what
I was suggesting. I was just suggesting. I think that's actually an awesome way to do it. Like, let's look and see what happens. It works. It's going to work when we get to the right answer. Which one is easier? And then I think it's from there picking up with the questioning of like, well, what criteria goes into the decision? So we now know that this one is easier. What made it easier? Dimensions. Okay, so one thing we look for is where are the missing dimensions and how do I avoid them? What is another thing that made it easier? Well, that one just looks like an easier rectangle. Like those look like 2 normal size rectangles. This made it into like a weird rectangle and a normal rectangle. Okay, so you're looking for the regularity of the shape. And getting them to have like a criteria or a process that they can then apply going forward. So but introducing it that way visually is really awesome, because then they see like, yep, still works, but now what? It's the same, and you did a really nice job with this during the word problems. It's like, sure, you could draw a picture,
Right.
You absolutely can draw a picture. You're not going to draw a picture. Please don't draw a picture.
Yeah.
You could use it. It totally works. But it's why do we make the choices that we make?
Right.
As opposed to, well, just choose a strategy off the list.
Yeah.
It's the same concept here, just more specific and unfortunately more difficult because it's
Right.
into a very deep conceptual issue. And then this ties to ratio number 1, which is as you had them, and in the example, to use your example from yesterday, as you had that split, really getting to see like, why does this happen?
Right.
Why is this happening?
Mm-hmm.
And how is it working?
Right.
And getting them to, and they're not going to get all the way to like, it's an extremely in-depth answer, but they should be able to get to the point where they say, well, we're not changing anything.
Yeah.
We're not changing the shape in any way. We're just cutting it up.
Right.
So it doesn't matter because just like a number can be decomposed into a variety of different ways. 1 plus 4 equals 5, 2 plus 3 equals 5,
Right.
0 plus 5 equals 5. I can take this shape and I can split it up because I'm not changing it. I'm not moving it anywhere. I'm not cutting anything. And getting them to see that why, but then connecting it to another math concept that makes it like a little bit more of an, oh, I get that. That makes sense. And decomposing shapes and decomposing numbers is a great connecting point because you can make it as simple as, what do we know about the number 5? How many ways can you add to 5? That's interesting. So how does that connect to the idea that I can cut this into as many shapes as I want? And when I put it all back together, it's still going to give me the total area.
Right.
Any questions about any of that feedback?
No, I started something for this lesson because it can be so confusing.
It really did not seem.
They did much better than last year. I think last year.
And it can be really confusing, and there was definitely some level of, some of them were a little like, well, how does this work? But they were doing, I mean, they handled it really well. The gestures, excluding that one time when they, but which seemed atypical to everybody else. It seemed more like they didn't understand what you were asking. They seemed to really be sticking with it.
Yeah. Did you hear Brian, his question?
No, what did they ask?
He raised his hand and you're in, but he was really quiet.
Oh, I did hear that.
Yeah. Like,
I don't get it. And so that's great. You put your chances to do it, so we're just going to keep going. Yeah, I did hear that.
So
I didn't know it was him, but I did hear that. That was really cute.
He's like,
I don't
get it.
It's really funny.
It was his first day back in school, too. And he was
Oh,
like,
so we missed the first day of yeah. And the first day did not have missing side lengths, is that correct?
No, and they had, so it went from
They
like
had
tiled
tiles
rectangles to
non-tiled
missing side lengths.
Yeah.
And they were just like,
Yeah, they kept with it. So
Yeah,
to
they were
the extent,
okay.
and maybe the way to mediate that in the other, or mitigate that, excuse me, in the other process is to think about like a bridge lesson that's done during reteach that day.
we
So it's like,
talked about that yesterday.
yeah, so they do like tiles with no missing side lengths, then they do no tiles, no missing side lengths, and then they are kind of pre-taught before going into the one where it's like, no tiles, missing side lengths, take that.
Yeah, we'd also talk about like giving them the tiles in smaller numbers and like, do you see how like there are tiles?
Draw the tiles.
Here.
They're in there.
They're there. You just can't
the invisible
see them.
tiles.
Yeah,
Those are
You're
there.
not, like,
They're just
they're
invisible.
Right? They're actually
She was like, okay.
I can draw them on.
I'm
it will
with
work.
you. She's a creative little girl. I'm sure that
She
she was like, invisible tiles. That works for me.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're good on the 3 things we kind of covered was the structure of the conversations. 2 things, structure the conversations, and then how to use hypothetical strategy in evaluating questioning. Any questions on how that fits in instruction or in curriculum? You probably have a good sense of that.
Yeah, I mean,
And I wouldn't worry too much on the curricular level. It's some awesome shapes, so it's
Yeah.
more an execution.
I've been trying to put this stuff in the curriculum, but sometimes it's like more in, because it is like this conversational piece, it's like a lot of responding to whatever they come up with that day.
Yeah.
And so it's hard.
This is a lot more about like developing your toolkit
Right.
so that you're thinking about like what are the different ways that I can take what they're giving me and then push them back a little bit harder.
Yeah.
And then you're going to follow up with Ms.
Mr.
Garcia
Oh, yeah.
about the conversations and then Mr. Ramon and Mr. Amaya and Ms. Scott about the conversations. All right.
Is there a huge difference in what second graders can say back to you though? I don't really know anything about like.
No, not really.
Okay.
They can articulate back. They can still do it. Some more than others. And I
Right.
think that point that you made, where in the beginning, it's a lot of like being really strategic on who you're
Yeah.
allowing to participate in the conversation.
Yeah.
That will be more important in second
Okay.
because there are some who are really verbally quick,
Right.
who will be fine, and then there are some who are in the high group who can't get called on right now to ask a question because they'd be really confused.
Right.
But I do think that they can start the ball rolling.
Yeah.
It won't look the same,
Right.
but they can get it going in the right direction.
Okay.
All right, awesome.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so
Miss
much, and thank you for letting me take this.
Okay, of course. Have a good day.
Thank you, you too. Let's see if I did this correctly.